It is a winter night in 1973, and you are alone. You have been alone for 600 miles. The cab of your rig is lit by the glow of the instrument panel and nothing else, and the interstate ahead is a black line drawn between snow-dusted fields somewhere west of Tulsa. Diesel has jumped 30% in 3 months. Washington has just dropped the speed limit to 55 miles per hour, which means every load takes longer and pays the same. Your dispatcher is a voice you heard 4 hours ago at a truck stop payphone. The next one is 200 miles away. The only thing connecting you to another human being is a metal box mounted under your dashboard, wired to an antenna on your roof, tuned to one of 23 channels on the 27 megahertz band. You reach for the microphone, press the button, and say the words that will open a conversation with someone you have never met and will never see. Breaker 19. Anybody got their ears on? A squelch break. Then a voice comes back, somewhere ahead of you in the dark, with a name that is not a name, a handle. Then another voice. Then another. Within 3 years, roughly 30 million Americans will be doing exactly what you are doing right now, talking to strangers on an open channel, choosing made-up names, building a community out of radio static and the human need to not be alone. This is the story of how a box under a dashboard became America's first social network, and of the man who invented the idea and never saw a dime from what it became. You're watching Digital Relics, where we trace the machines that reshaped everyday life all the way back to the first crude version and the people who built it. If that's your kind of story, subscribe and hit like, because the road to the world's first social network starts in a teenager's bedroom in Cleveland, and nobody saw where it was heading. To understand what the CB radio did, you have to understand the world it was born into. By the late 1950s, the United States had built the largest road network in human history. The interstate highway system connected every major city with ribbons of asphalt that a truck could drive from coast to coast without stopping for a traffic light. The system moved goods, it moved people. But the men who drove it, the long-haul truckers who spent weeks in a cab hauling freight from Los Angeles to New York, from Seattle to Miami, were among the most isolated workers in America. A trucker in 1960 had no way to warn the driver behind him of a wreck ahead. No way to know whether the fuel stop in 100 miles still had diesel. No way to hear a human voice between dispatcher calls placed from payphones bolted to the walls of truck stops. The car radio talked at you, but it could not hear you back. Two-way radio existed, but the kind available to civilians, amateur ham radio, required a federal examination, a technical license, and a knowledge of electronics that most working drivers did not have and could not spare the time to learn. The isolation was more than an inconvenience. It was the defining condition of the job. A trucker might drive 1,000 miles, and the only people he spoke to were the waitress at a diner counter and the voice of a dispatcher reading him his next load. At 2 a.m, crossing Nebraska in the dark, the only sound was the engine and the AM station fading in and out between signal towers. If a wreck blocked the road ahead, you found out when you saw the flares. If your engine threw a belt on a stretch of empty highway, you walked to the nearest farmhouse and hoped someone was awake. Every interstate rest stop had a line of drivers waiting for a payphone, dropping quarters into a slot, talking to a wife or a dispatcher for 3 minutes, then climbing back into the cab and back into the silence. America had built a network of roads. The people who drove them had no network at all. They were connected by asphalt and separated by silence. One man in Cleveland had been thinking about that silence since he was a boy, and the device he imagined would change the shape of American life in ways he would never live to see rewarded. His name was Al Gross. Born on the 22nd of February, 1918, in Toronto, Canada, he grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, where as a boy, he heard a ship talking to shore on a shortwave receiver and knew immediately what he wanted to build. Not a radio for the military, not a radio for the licensed expert, a radio for everyone. By his early 20s, he had built a two-way radio small enough to carry in a hand, the device that would later be called the walkie-talkie. During World War II, he put that skill to work for the Office of Strategic Services, developing portable radio systems that agents used behind enemy lines in occupied Europe. When the war ended, he turned to civilian applications. His vision was specific: a radio band that any citizen could use without a technical examination, a citizen's band. In 1947, the FCC listened. They authorized the first citizens band radio service on UHF frequencies between 460 and 470 megahertz. The idea was exactly right. The technology was not ready. The UHF equipment was expensive, the range was poor, and the radios were too large and too costly for an ordinary person to justify owning. Almost nobody bought one. The Citizens Band existed on paper and in a handful of electronic shops, but it had not yet found its people. That would take 11 more years, a different frequency, and a decision by the FCC to try again. In September of 1958, the FCC created Class D Citizens Band on 27 megahertz, with 23 channels and a new principle. No technical exam required. Anyone could operate one. The license cost $4 and a form mailed to Washington. The 27 megahertz band was chosen for a practical reason. Equipment that worked on it could be manufactured cheaply. But cheaply was a relative word. The first CB radios were tube-based, heavy, temperamental, and priced above $100, which in 1958 was the equivalent of roughly $800 today. For a working trucker earning by the mile, that was a serious commitment. Sales were modest. Through the early 1960s, CB radio remained a hobbyist's curiosity, a tool for a small community of electronics tinkerers, farmers who used it to coordinate across remote acreage, and a scattered few thousand truckers who could justify the cost. In 1962, a volunteer organization called REACT, the Radio Emergency Associated Communication Teams, formed to monitor Channel 9 for emergencies. Volunteers staffed base stations and listened for distress calls from drivers stranded on highways years before 911 existed as a national emergency standard. REACT gave CB radio its first organized community and its first public service mission, the first proof that the technology could save a life and not just carry a conversation. The range was limited, roughly 4 to 5 miles on flat ground with a good antenna, and the signal crackled with static, but for a trucker broken down on a dark shoulder at midnight. Those 4 miles were the difference between waiting alone until dawn and hearing a human voice say, "Help was on the way." Meanwhile, Al Gross watched the industry built on his ideas begin to stir. His patents on portable wireless communication had already expired. The technology he had conceived, the radio anyone could use, was slowly spreading through the cabs and kitchens of America. And the man whose work had seeded it would not see a dollar from the harvest. He continued working on wireless devices in quiet obscurity. The world moved on without crediting him. For 15 years, the CB radio sat in the cabs of a few 100,000 truckers and hobbyists, a quiet tool doing a quiet job. Then, the price of oil changed everything. In October of 1973, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries declared an oil embargo against the United States. Fuel prices spiked overnight. In January of 1974, the federal government signed the National Maximum Speed Law, dropping the limit to 55 miles per hour on every highway in the country. For independent truckers, this was not a policy adjustment. It was an economic catastrophe. Fuel costs had roughly doubled in a matter of weeks. The lower speed limit meant every haul took longer, and the pay did not increase to match. Margins that had been thin collapsed to nothing. The CB radio, already mounted in some fraction of truck cabs, became the tool of survival. Truckers used it to share real-time intelligence on which fuel stops still had diesel and which had run dry. They used it to warn each other about speed traps, which they called smoky reports, after the campaign hats worn by state highway troopers. They used it to coordinate routes and share road conditions mile by mile, and then they used it for something nobody had planned: In December of 1973 and into early 1974, independent truckers organized work stoppages and highway blockades across the country. They had no union headquarters. They had no phone tree. They had Channel 19 and a microphone. The shutdown was coordinated entirely by CB Radio, the first mass collective action in American history, organized by civilian wireless. The CB had crossed a line. It was no longer a communication device. It was an organizing platform. What the truckers were doing, talking to strangers without seeing a face, building alliances under assumed names, sharing intelligence in real time, coordinating collective action through a network with no center and no leader, had no name in 1973. It would get one decades later, but the truckers did not need a name for it. They needed fuel, and they needed each other, and the box under the dashboard gave them both. The private tool of the long-haul driver was about to become the biggest communications phenomenon in American history, and the wave was already building. The transistor did what the transistor always does. It shrank the machine and dropped the price. Through the late 1960s and early 70s, solid-state circuits replaced vacuum tubes in CB radio design, cutting the weight, improving the reliability, and bringing the costs down year after year. Japanese manufacturers entered the market with aggressive pricing and drove costs lower still. By 1975, a decent mobile CB radio cost between $40 and $60 instead of well over $100. The effect was immediate and enormous. CB radio sales, which had been steady but modest through the 60s, went vertical. The FCC, which still required a $4 license for every CB operator, was overwhelmed. At the peak of the craze in 1976 and 77, the Commission received roughly 800,000 license applications per month. The backlog stretched to years. By 1977, an estimated 25 to 30 million Americans were using CB radios. Not just truckers anymore. Families bolted them to car dashboards for road trips. Teenagers mounted them in bedrooms as the world's cheapest party line. Small business owners installed base stations. The CB radio industry became a billion-dollar market in the space of 3 years. A transformation driven not by marketing, but by a genuine hunger to talk. On the 1st of January, 1977, the FCC expanded the band from 23 channels to 40. A concession to the reality that the airwaves were so choked with voices that conversation on some channels had become impossible. The congestion was the proof. There were not enough frequencies for the number of people who wanted to speak. When Betty Ford, the First Lady of the United States, adopted the CB handle, First Mama, and chatted with truckers from the presidential motorcade during the 1976 campaign, the transformation was undeniable. A device built for long-haul drivers and electronics hobbyists had become a national pastime. The fringe had become the center, but the center was about to produce something that American technology crazes always produce. A culture with its own language, its own mythology, and its own Hollywood heroes, and the machines at the heart of it would earn a reverence that outlasted the fad itself. CB radio did not simply gain millions of users in the mid-1970s. It built a parallel society. Users chose handles, nicknames, that replaced their real names the way a later generation would choose screen names on the internet. Rubber Duck, White Knight, Knight Rider. The handle was not decoration, it was identity. A trucker might spend years talking to a voice he knew only as Big Daddy on Channel 19, without ever learning the man's legal name, and the friendship was no less real for the anonymity. The channels had structure that emerged by custom, not by design. Channel 19 became the trucker highway channel, the open roads party line, where any driver could break in with a smoky report or a request for directions, and know that someone within range would answer. Channel 9 was the emergency frequency, monitored around the clock by React volunteers. The rest were divided by local habit, one channel for a town's conversation, another for skip shooters, chasing long-distance signals bouncing off the ionosphere. The language was a code inside a code. 10-4 for affirmative, smoky for police, Bear in the air for a helicopter with a radar gun. What's your 20 for your location? Breaker for permission to enter the conversation. The etiquette was enforced by the users themselves. Step on someone's transmission and you were corrected. Hog a channel and you were told to move on. There was no moderator. There was no terms of service. There was only the open channel and the consensus of the voices on it. Decades before the internet made the same architecture out of fiber optic cable and code, the CB radio had already built it out of antenna wire and 27 megahertz. Then, the culture went mainstream with a speed that startled even the people inside it. In 1975, a fictional trucker character created by advertising man Bill Fries, performing under the name C.W. McCall, recorded a novelty track called Convoy, built entirely from CB slang, the story of a trucker convoy rolling across the American interstate system. It reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in January of 1976. In 1977, Smokey and the Bandit, starring Burt Reynolds and Jerry Reed, with CB chatter woven through every chase scene, earned roughly $126 million at the American box office and became the second highest grossing film of the year behind only Star Wars. In 1978, Sam Peckinpah directed Convoy, starring Chris Christopherson, a feature film inspired directly by the McCall song. The trucker had become a folk hero, and the CB radio was the instrument of his mythology. The machines themselves earned their own place in the story. The Cobra 29 LTD, manufactured by Dynascan Corporation of Chicago, arrived in the mid-1970s and became the defining CB radio of the era. Dynascan had been founded by Carl Korn in 1948 as a test equipment company, but the CB boom reshaped it entirely. The Cobra 29 was 40 channels, AM, with a chrome faceplate, a large channel knob you could turn with gloved hands, a front-facing speaker loud enough to cut through diesel engine noise, and a build quality engineered to survive years of vibration bolted under a truck dashboard. The microphone was heavy in the hand. The push-to-talk button had a solid click. The squelch knob hissed when you turned it, and the moment a voice came through, the speaker filled the cab with a presence that made the dark outside feel smaller. It was not the first CB radio made. It was not the most technically advanced. It was the one that defined the shape. Truckers treated it as the standard the way guitar players treated the Stratocaster, not because nothing else existed, but because everything else was measured against it. A working vintage Cobra 29 from the 1970s sells today for $75 to over $150 on collector markets, half a century after it was built. The Cobra 138 XLR, released in the late 1970s, was the enthusiast's machine. The radio for the operator who wanted to reach farther than the format was designed to allow. Its single sideband capability effectively doubled the transmission range compared to standard AM, pushing a consumer radio on 27 megahertz to distances its engineers had not originally imagined. IEE Spectrum later inducted the Cobra 138 XLR into the Consumer Electronics Hall of Fame, a formal recognition that a CB radio had pushed the engineering boundary of its own medium. But by the time the 138 XLR reached the hands of the power users who loved it most, the channels were growing crowded with casual voices. The novelty was fading for the millions who had driven the boom, and somewhere in a research laboratory, engineers were quietly working on a telephone that would need no wire, no shared channel, and no handle. The CB radio did not know it yet, but its replacement was already being built, and it would not come from the radio industry at all. The thing that replaced the CB radio did not arrive from the radio industry. It arrived from the telephone industry, and it offered something the CB never could: a private conversation. In 1983, the year the FCC dropped CB licensing, the first commercial cellular network also launched in the United States. The early handset, the Motorola DynaTAC 8000X, weighed nearly a kilogram and cost close to $4,000, and the coverage was measured in city blocks rather than highway corridors, but the principle was clear. The cell phone connected you to a specific person. The CB radio connected you to anyone within range, which was its genius and for the general public, eventually its limitation. By the early 1980s, the CB craze had already cooled for casual users. The 40 channels were crowded with chatter, profanity, and interference. The novelty of talking to strangers, which had thrilled a nation for 3 years, wore thin for the people who had no practical need for it. In 1983, the FCC dropped the individual licensing requirement for CB radio entirely, a concession that came too late to matter. The millions who had driven the boom had already moved on. Through the 1990s, cell phones fell in price, shrank in size, and multiplied in pockets. GPS navigation systems replaced the truckers' dependence on CB reports for directions and road conditions. Fleet management software gave dispatchers constant contact with their drivers without needing an open channel. The CB radio did not die in a single year or because of a single device. The world that had made it essential quietly dissolved around it, replaced one function at a time by technologies that were more precise, more private, and less interesting. The Dynatac that cost $4,000 in 1983 cost under $200 as a basic cell phone by the mid-90s. The math was the same math the CB had written in reverse. The price dropped, the users multiplied, and the older machine moved to the margins. You can read the CB radio story two ways, and honest history holds both at once. One reading says it was a fad, a craze that burned hot and burned out, replaced by machines that did the same job better. The numbers support that reading. From 30 million users to a fraction of that within a decade. From a billion-dollar market to a niche. The other reading says the CB radio was a proof of concept for something permanent. The first demonstration that ordinary people, handed an open channel and an anonymous name, would build a community from nothing, would invent a language and an etiquette and a culture in the space of a few years, and would use that community to organize, to inform, to protect, and to belong. The fact that they did it again on the internet 20 years later, with usernames instead of handles and chat rooms instead of channels, is not a coincidence. It is a pattern. The CB radio discovered it first. The pattern did not disappear when the radios fell silent. It dissolved into everything that came after. The handle became the screen name. The channel became the chat room. The Smokey report became the traffic update crowdsourced by 1,000 phones. The open call of Breaker became the first post in a forum thread. The convoy, a group of strangers organized in real time by anonymous voices moving in the same direction, became the Facebook group, the Reddit thread, the Discord server. The CB radio had built the architecture of online life out of antenna wire and analog static, 30 years before the first social media platform wrote a line of code. In 1973, a trucker pressed a mic button on a Cobra mounted under his dashboard and spoke to strangers in the dark on 27 megahertz. In 1995, a college student opened a chat room and typed a message to strangers on a glowing screen. In 2006, a user posted a status update to a feed that millions of people could read. The technology changed with each generation. The human impulse, the need to speak to someone you have never met and might never see. The need to belong to a community that knows you only by the name you chose, did not change at all. Meanwhile, for truckers, the CB narrowed to its essential purpose: hazard warnings, road conditions, the sound of a human voice on a long night run. It was no longer a fad, it was a tool again, the thing it had been before the world noticed it, and it was no less valuable for the silence of the channels around it. The Cobra 29 LTD is still manufactured. The radio that defined the format half a century ago is still sold today as the Cobra 29 LTD Classic, updated with FM capability and modern components, but recognizably the same machine, the same chrome face, the same channel knob, the same speaker built to cut through engine noise. Truckers still key up on Channel 19. React Volunteers, the organization founded in 1962, still monitor Channel 9. Vintage CB radios are collected, restored, and traded by enthusiast communities who treat a clean, original Cobra 29 from the 70s. The way car collectors treat a matching numbers muscle car, a machine whose value lies not in what it does, but in what it proved. The Cobra 138 XLR, the IEE Hall of Fame radio, commands higher prices still, sought by operators who remember what single sideband could do on a clear night. The slang has outlived the craze entirely. 10-4 and What's Your 20 and Smokey entered the permanent American vocabulary, used daily by people who have never touched a CB microphone and do not know where the words came from. Surveys of long-haul drivers consistently report that a majority still carry a CB in the cab. When an ice storm closes a highway in Wyoming or construction narrows an interstate to a single lane in Tennessee, the cell phone cannot tell you what the driver a quarter mile ahead of you sees through his windshield. The CB can. But the truest verdict on the CB radio is not the collector prices or the Hollywood films or the songs that hit #1. It is the fact that truckers, the people who used the machine hardest and longest, never stopped. They had cell phones, they had GPS, they had satellite radio and apps that replicated every function of a CB with better range and clearer audio, and they kept the Cobra mounted under the dashboard anyway, because no app and no algorithm replicates the open channel, the anonymous voice, the stranger who has your back on a dark stretch of interstate without knowing your name. That is the user's verdict, and it has held for 50 years. Somewhere tonight, on a stretch of interstate you have driven past without thinking about it, a trucker is reaching for a microphone mounted under a dashboard. The radio is tuned to channel 19 on the 27 megahertz band, the same frequency the FCC opened in 1958, the same channel the truckers claimed as their own half a century ago. The trucker presses the button and says the words, "Breaker 19, a squelch break." A voice comes back. The CB radio proved something the internet would prove again 20 years later. Give ordinary people a way to talk to strangers, and they will build a society inside the signal. Al Gross, the man who imagined a radio for everyone, died in Sun City, Arizona on the 21st of December, 2000. Without earning a royalty from the device his work made possible. The industry his ideas built was worth $1 billion at its peak. The community it created outlasted the industry. The impulse it revealed, the need to reach into the dark and hear a voice come back, outlasted everything. If you drove with a CB mounted under your dash, if you had a handle and a home channel, if you remember the first time a stranger's voice came back through the static and you knew you were not alone out there, tell us in the comments. Drop your handle, the radio you used, and whether you still have your ears on. The people who keyed up on those channels know more about what the CB radio meant than the people who sold them. Subscribe to Digital Relics if you want to be here when we trace the next machine back to its beginning. We have the origin of another device that changed the way strangers talk to each other, and you will not want to miss where that story starts.